The story is about a man who his main problem, his flaw, so to speak, is that he's an optimist, and this leads to a lot of trouble in his life. And that was where I started the book. Was more interested in the idea of what if optimism, which we always say we should have and we should always have hope, is actually the thing that gets you in trouble in life. And maybe if you were a pessimist, you'd be happier. So he has a professor who is trying to train him to be less hopeful. And what happened was I took that character and I thought, well, what's the worst thing that could happen to somebody who is hopeful? Mm-hmm. And so the first thing I thought was, well, maybe they'd do something very positive. Like, so Kugel, the main character, decides, I'm sick of all this history and past, and he's got a fucked up mother, and he said, you know what, to hell with it, I'm moving out to the country. I'm going to get a nice old farmhouse, and I'm going to start over with my wife and my little son, and everything's going to be happy. And then he makes some bad decisions. First of all, he brings his mother with him, hoping she's going to die, but she's not. And then he finds out that there's an arsonist running around the community who's burning down houses. And then one night he's awake and he's hearing this ticking noise in the attic, and he thinks that maybe it's the arsonist. And he goes upstairs and he finds an old woman hiding behind some boxes who says she's Anne Frank. And to me, it was like, what's the worst thing that could happen if you decided you wanted to be rid of the past and all of the ugliness of history? Yeah. Well, you'd find somebody from
in your house.
And somehow that, in my head, became Anne Frank. Yeah. So when she said that, I was as surprised as anybody, but it made me laugh. I remember sitting in a coffee place in New York and writing. And originally the story was that it's a guy whose mother is always worried about the Holocaust coming. And so once or twice a year he's working in the house and he hears a noise and he goes upstairs and Mom's there in the attic and she's preparing for the next Holocaust.
That was the original plan.
That was the original plan. Okay. But then I realized as I was writing I was doing so much to get away from Anne Frank that one day I just said, oh, fuck it, it's Anne Frank.
I can imagine.
And that made me laugh. And then I remember I phoned my wife, and I said, I think I figured it out. I think I know what this book is about. And then I hung up, and she goes, what? And I said, it's Anne Frank, and she's in the attic. And she laughed, and then I hung up, and then seriously I called my shrink. And I said, there's something wrong with me.
Okay. We can get to the shrink later. Of course, we all grew up learning the story of Anne Frank, at least here in Holland, I guess, all over the world. Yeah. Perhaps. At what point, was there a point actually in your life where your interest in Anne Frank became above average? Where you thought, this is a very interesting person, visit a museum?
No, it was the opposite.
Okay. Running away from the...
Yeah, I mean, I was raised with a lot of... oddly enough, the two main characters in my life as a child growing up in a religious Jewish home were God and Hitler. Yeah. And they were both assholes. And they were very similar, which made it a little confusing theologically. Because you were supposed to hate one and love the other, but they seemed to have a lot in common. So one of the things they did every year, there was a Holocaust Memorial Day once a year, and they bring all the little kids into the room, into the big auditorium, and there's a big screen, an enormous screen, and when you walk in, there's a picture of this little girl. This smiling little girl. And so you're 6 years old, and you see her, and you know this is not going to end well. I don't think this has a happy ending. And then they show you all this footage of, Dachau and the mass graves, and you're 6 years old, and you're like, holy shit. And they tell you the story of her, and they end with her back on the screen again, and everyone's crying. And you're crying, because you're 6, and now, and they tell a terrible story. Yeah. And then they do that every year. So they do it when you're 7, and you do it when you're 8. And by the time you're 9, you're going, oh, God, is it Holocaust Memorial Day? Can I be sick today, Mom? Yeah. I don't want to go to school. And then by the time at least for me, was 16 or 17, and it's not something you're supposed to say because we all know the story and it's horrible, but by the time I'm 16 or 17, I walk in and I see her and I just go, oh, fuck off. I'm sick of you. Because
every year you were
because basically it becomes not a person, it becomes an icon, and that icon represents misery and suffering, specifically mine, and that this is your fate, that one way or the other, it may not be your generation, and if you're lucky enough to not die in an oven, then your kids probably will. And if they don't, then there's no way your grandchildren won't. You're never going to go three generations without some sort of an inquisition or a slavery in Egypt or something. And so, I was the last person who was ever going to write a book about the Holocaust. It's just, I don't read them.
We're sick of them as a child.
Yeah, in fact, the one book review I've ever done, because I don't like book reviews, I was asked to review Norman Mailer's last book, which was called The Castle in the Forest. And I said, well, whatever, it's $500. And they send me this book, it's that fucking thick, and the whole cover is black with a swastika on it. And so my review was basically 1,500 words about how there's no way I'm opening that book.
Wow.
Because it has a swastika on it.
You should send this to me.
And so it was just like I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And I think part of this, for me, I decided to write it after the birth of my second son. And I just wanted, because I have two little kids, and for me the question of fate, because that's what she represented, was your fate. You're going to die at the hands of somebody else.
Because you're a Jew.
Brutally. Was something I now had to look at my kids and what do I tell them? Because I'm not going to tell them that. And I'm sure as fuck not going to tell them, well, everyone is happy and gets along. I don't smoke that much pot to be able to do that. So I have to find some way to deal with fate and history, and that was why I did this.
So this story of Anne Frank became quite a personal, negative story for you, because you were forced to eat it every year again.
Yeah, it's basically walking into a room with all your friends and there's a big sign on the wall that says you're fucked.
I can imagine, and Frank being the most innocent little girl,
the picture of it,
didn't ask for anything, of course.
Right.
It kind of makes sense that you put a very optimistic protagonist in a situation where he meets this very negative protagonist in your personal life. So let's see what happens. What struck me in the beginning, you wrote a passage of several pages, which I thought was funny, because you started the novel with a passage of several pages concerning the final words of people. How to end your life with the proper words or sentences. Is it somehow connected?
Well, it's just something I always obsessed about, and the main character Kugel is constantly thinking about what he wants his final words to be right before he dies. That it should be something noble and important and meaningful, and it never is. But he knows the last words of every famous person, from Jesus to Abbott and Costello. And he considers them, and he carries a notebook around with him, so if it ever occurs to him what the proper thing is, he'll write it down and remember to say it just before he dies. I just like the idea of someone who's optimistic being obsessed with death, but in an optimistic way. Like, he's actually hopeful that he can come up with the right set of words
when the moment
to
is
say
right,
that will encapsulate everything. And so he's constantly worrying about that.
I think it makes sense that an optimistic is concerned with death at the end of life. Because he is an optimistic, he wants to celebrate life, so the end of life obviously is an important issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think religion is sort of the most pure form of optimism, because it's based on nothing. God hasn't spoken to anybody in a very long time, but there's this absolute certainty that when you die, there's going to be a fantastic place, and it's going to be packed with harps and virgins and good food and an open bar, and it's just going to be fucking awesome, and it's based on nothing. It's just like, wow.
Because you have lived,
good luck with that. I can't even buy a lottery ticket, and they're going, well, I think there's going to be great shit after you die.
Is this optimism of the protagonist, can it somehow be derived from you as a person? because, well, you told about how you grew up eating the story of Anne Frank every year, having to face the horrible fate of the generations before you. So there's a lot of blackness and death, and of course the story of the Holocaust and the Second World War. There's a lot of extremely negative stories. Does it make you, per definition, an optimistic person?
Well,
or an optimistic writer, perhaps?
Well, I hope it's not the latter. But the first thing a psychiatrist ever said to me was that I have a terrible streak of optimism, and that it's causing me a lot of depression.
Okay.
Which ends up being true. And the funny thing is that a lot of therapists will acknowledge that one of the main jobs that they have is to lower their patients' expectations. You're probably not going to be this tall. You're probably not going to marry someone who's perfect. You're not going to be a millionaire. You're not going to have abs. You're going to be that guy. Yeah. And as long as you accept that, then you'll probably be, mediocre happiness. If you keep waiting for that, it's going to be sad. Yeah. So for me, that was always the thing. But I was raised, on very depressing stories. The most depressing one being the Old Testament, which is, it's, hey, creation and Eden, now get the fuck out. And, hey, you're out of Egypt, you're free, now you're stuck in the desert for 40 years. Every time there's good news, it's followed by tragically bad news. Yeah. To even today, hey, you got a country of your own. Yeah, well, maybe not so great. Maybe not so great. So everything sucked in the end, and so I think that for me it was important to try and find. I think there probably were parts of me as a kid that each year came into that auditorium thinking maybe this year it'll end differently. Maybe this year a helicopter lands on the roof and all the Franks run up there but it never happened that way. No. And also, with biblical stories, because each year you start another book and it's like, well, maybe this one won't suck. So I think that for me it was always like, how do you deal with, for me, in my life, it's like, how do you deal with the knowledge that everything sort of goes to hell? And if I were single and didn't have kids and a wife, I'd probably just go with that. Yeah. I think it was very easy for Kafka and Beckett to be nihilists. It's great. It's the way I would be. It's easy. Yeah, but I have a 5-year-old in the back who's dressed up like Spider-Man, and I'm taking him to go buy toys. Yeah. And I can't say, well, Spider-Man dies too, and these toys are made by underpaid workers in China, and it's filled with poison. Yeah.
It's hard to be negative with a
like
young
your whole
kid.
Job, the whole job of having a kid is be a liar. Yeah. Yeah. Bullshit for the rest of your life. Pretend that everything is good. Yeah, exactly.
Starting with Santa Claus, of course.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to find, so for me, the happy medium was saying, well, I don't think that I would tell them that life and people are good, but I would tell them that, odds are you might die at the hands of others, but it's not because of who you are. There's no target on your back. It's not because everybody dies at the hands of other people. It's awful for everybody, not just you. And I think for me, it was growing up being told it was personal. So I had to find something within it that I could either find, since there's no hope in the stories themselves, there was at least a way to laugh at the story or the storyteller.
So you use humor in a kind of positive way to deal with the negative stories and the negative history.
Yeah, there's an expression in English, I don't know, you probably have a similar one, about whistling past the graveyard, which implies pretending that there's no death. And this is joking past the graveyard. I have a photo that I love that I live in Woodstock, in a small town in New York, and I walk a lot, and one of the places I pass when I walk is the town cemetery, and right in front of one of the tombstones, right in front of the gate, the person's last name is Happy. So there's a tombstone that says Happy on it, and it's like Happy died 1833. And the only thing that would be better is if it had died the year of my birth. That would have died 1970. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense.